Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. Today, we are tossing all that pop culture aside. We're going to completely dismantle the classic Viking stereotype, and we're doing it using hard, historical, and archaeological evidence. I want you to just picture your classic pop culture Viking for a second. You're probably envisioning this massive, incredibly violent, maybe a bit grimy warrior stepping off a longship, right? Rocking a heavy fur cloak and the super menacing horned helmet. I mean, it's a fantastic dramatic image. But we are going to systematically peel back every single layer of that misconception to reveal the absolutely fascinating truth underneath. Just look at the incredible contrast here. On one side, we've got the giant stereotypical warrior we all instantly recognize, complete with those iconic sweeping horns. But on the other, that's an authentic Viking helmet insert straight from an archaeological dig. And yep, not a single horn in sight. This little comparison sets the absolute perfect baseline for the myths we're going to be dismantling today. So, here is our hit list of historical realities we'll be unpacking. 1. Horns and skull cups. 2. More than just raiders. 3. Viking age hygiene standards. And 4. The racial purity myth. Okay, section 1. Horns and skull cups. Now, paintings from the 1800s like this one make them look unbelievably heroic, but here's the historical truth. There is absolutely zero archaeological evidence that Viking warriors ever wore horned helmets in battle. I mean, think about it practically for a second. Having massive horns on your head would be a terrible disadvantage in close combat. You're basically giving your enemy the perfect handles to grab onto. Instead, this iconic look was actually popularized in the 1800s by costume designers working on theater productions. It really kicked off with Richard Wagner's epic ring cycle operas. It was just pure theater, designed to make the characters look larger than life. But the seed of that theatrical idea actually goes back even further to Renaissance scholars. You see, they were reading these ancient Roman descriptions of earlier Germanic tribes who, to be fair, sometimes did use animal motifs and horns in their ceremonial gear. But the scholars ended up blending those ancient Roman descriptions with their own highly romanticized visions of the Nordic Vikings. They basically just mixed up the timelines and the cultures. And honestly, that academic confusion brilliantly illustrates our next myth. You have definitely heard the gruesome tale that Vikings drank mead from the human skulls of their vanquished enemies, right? Sounds absolutely terrifying. It's also completely false. This whole myth is literally based on a bad translation. In skaldic poetry, the Old Norse phrase "vor butredum hausa" literally translates to branches of skulls. But in the poetic language of that era, it was just a really colorful metaphor for an animal's horn. That's it. They were drinking from regular old animal horns, not human skulls. Let's move on to section 2. More than just raiders. Now, to be totally fair to history here, the word Vikinger in early Scandinavian languages actually did mean pirate, and they absolutely did conduct violent, terrifying coastal raids. No denying that. However, it is so crucial to acknowledge that this spectacular, action-packed lifestyle we always see represented only a tiny minority of the Scandinavian population at the time. Going a Viking was a very specific profession, or honestly just a seasonal activity for a select few. It was definitely not the default lifestyle for an entire culture. So what were the rest of them doing? Well, the reality is a lot more settled. The vast majority of people during the Viking Age were actually independent farmers living pretty peaceful lives. They were busy sowing barley and wheat, raising livestock, and just trying to survive those brutal northern winters. And beyond farming, they were incredibly skilled craftsmen, artisans, and builders. They lived in these highly organized, really successful trade centers, like the city of Ribe in Denmark, where daily life revolved around family, craftsmanship, and commerce, not warfare. And they definitely weren't just trading in their own backyards. Looking at their extensive trade routes proves they were master navigators and incredibly sophisticated merchants. Their trade networks extended all the way from the coast of North America to Afghanistan. They were exchanging northern goods like furs, amber, and iron for exotic luxuries like silk, silver, and spices. They reached as far as the Byzantine capital of Constantinople and the Islamic Golden Age city of Baghdad. A real game changer when you think about their global footprint. All right, section 3, Viking age hygiene standards. You might be surprised by this, but archaeologists routinely excavate what we can basically only describe as Viking grooming kits. We find these beautifully crafted combs made out of animal bone, primitive tweezers, razors, and even ear spoons that were specifically designed for personal upkeep. And these aren't rare finds at all. They are incredibly common in grave sites all across Scandinavia. This completely shatters that grimy, unwashed movie stereotype. They clearly cared a huge deal about their personal appearance and cleanliness. In fact, historical records written by the people they interacted with often comment on their hygiene. The texts show that Vikings bathed at least once a week. Now, okay, I know that might not sound like a whole lot to us today, but we have to put it in historical context. This meant these supposed savages actually bathed far more frequently and had significantly better personal hygiene than most of their medieval European contemporaries. Which brings us to Section 4, the racial purity myth. To fully understand this myth, we have to look objectively at how history gets used and misused for political purposes. In the 1930s, the concept of the Vikings as some sort of pure Germanic master race was heavily nurtured and promoted by Nazi ideology. It was a very intentional misappropriation of history meant to serve a political agenda. And unfortunately, as source documents note, this false notion of ethnic purity still appeals to and is utilized by modern white supremacist movements who continue to use Norse symbolism today. We're just impartially reporting the history of how this image has been used here, but as you'll see, the actual science tells a completely different story. Because when you contrast those political ideologies with hard scientific reality, the purity myth completely falls apart. Modern archaeologists and geneticists don't have to just guess about who the Vikings were anymore. They can extract DNA directly from skeletal remains found at Viking Age burial sites. And the results of those massive genomic studies are crystal clear. As the analysis notes, it points to a mix of Scandinavian and non-Scandinavian peoples without clear ethnic distinctions. The genetics absolutely, completely refute the purity myth. Viking was a job description. It was a profession, not an ethnicity. The data reveals a really high degree of ethnic exchange and mobility. So rather than an isolated pure race, the Vikings actually represented this incredibly dynamic culture of fusion. Think about it. Their warbands naturally picked up new recruits from all over the places they traveled. They interacted and traded with the ancestors of the Inuit in North America. They integrated with cultures in Islamic Spain, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe. Their massive historical success didn't come from isolation. It actually came from their incredible ability to embrace, absorb, and adapt from a massive diversity of cultures all across the globe. So, here is a question to leave you with. If our standard popular image of the Vikings is largely built on Renaissance mix-ups, 19th century opera costumes, bad poetic translations, and 20th century political propaganda, what other historical facts that you just take for granted do we need to fundamentally rethink? It really goes to show why we've got to look past the pop culture image and dig straight into the evidence. Thank you so much for learning with me today, and stay curious.